The first time Warren Winslow saw Shagrol Strongtusk, she was standing in the middle of Duskfall's main road with a dead elk slung across her shoulders, blood painting a dark stripe across her collarbone, and every soul in the market square had gone utterly, completely silent. Warren had been loading a wagon outside Hartley's trading post, stacking grain sacks with the unhurried patience of a man who had long since made peace with hard labor, when the silence rolled through the street like a cold wind off the mountains. He straightened, one hand resting on the wagon rail, and looked. She was tall, taller than most men he knew, with the broad, green-skinned shoulders of someone who had spent a life doing real work. Her tusks curved upward from her lower jaw in twin arcs of pale ivory, neat and unbroken, and her dark hair was pulled back from her face in two thick braids that hung past her shoulder blades. She wore a fitted leather bodice, dark amber brown and laced tightly up the front, the kind of well-made piece that had been shaped specifically to a body, rather than cut for any body willing to wear it. Beneath it she wore a snug-waisted canvas travel shirt, deep green, tucked into close-fitting riding trousers of heavy oiled leather that disappeared into calf-high boots worn smooth at the heel. A knife sat at her hip in a plain sheath. A cord of silver beads, each one carved with small geometric marks, looped twice around her throat. She was, in every observable sense, extraordinary. She was also entirely alone, standing in the middle of a hostile crowd that had not yet decided what kind of hostile it intended to be. Warren watched the way her jaw was set, rigid. Her amber eyes moved from face to face without fear, but with a kind of braced readiness, the way a person looks when they have learned not to expect kindness and have simply calculated the odds of what comes instead. The elk was enormous, and she held it like it weighed nothing, one hand gripping a foreleg, its great antlered head hanging behind her shoulder. Clement Harker, who ran the butcher's stall and had an opinion about everything in Duskfall, stepped forward from the loose crowd that had gathered. "We don't buy from orcs," he said. There was a murmur of agreement, not universal, Warren noticed. Old Marrett, who sold dried herbs and asked no questions, said nothing. Rue, the blacksmith's wife, pressed her lips together and looked at her shoes, but enough voices joined in to make the silence before them feel like a wall. Shagrol set the elk down. She did not drop it. She lowered it with care, knees bending, controlled, the way you set something down when you do not want to show you are tired, when you have been carrying it a very long way and you will not let anyone know that. She straightened and looked at Harker. "I am not selling," she said. Her voice was low, measured, accented with the rhythmic cadences of orcish speech, the consonants a little harder, the vowels a little longer. "I need salt, cord, and a steel striker. I have pelts and smoked meat. I am offering a fair trade." "We don't trade with orcs either," Harker said. Someone laughed. It was not a kind laugh. Warren set down the grain sack he was holding. He did it slowly and without drama, and then he walked across the road. He heard the collective shift of attention as people noticed him moving. He paid it no particular regard. He had lived in Duskfall for 3 years, which was long enough for people to know him as quiet, reliable, and not a man who made decisions he had not already thought through. He stopped beside her. He looked at the elk, which was a very good elk, clean killed, well bled, the pelt intact. "Marrett," he said, raising his voice just enough to carry. "You still need that elk tendons for your cord work." Marrett blinked. Then slowly she straightened. "I do. And Rue," he said, "Garrett mentioned the forge is short on prime fat for tempering." Rue, after a pause, gave a small nod. Warren turned to Shagrol. Up close she was even more striking. The amber eyes held a steadiness that he associated with people who had been through things and come out the other side still standing. There was a small scar along her jaw, pale against the green of her skin. She was watching him with the same calculating attention she had given everyone else, except that something in her expression had shifted very slightly. Not softened, not yet, but recalibrated. "The trading post will take your pelts," Warren said, "and I know where the salt and cord are kept. What kind of striker do you need?" Flint and steel or spark stone? She looked at him for a long moment. Flint and steel, she said finally, one that will work wet. Hartley carries good ones, he said. I can take you in. Another silence. This one different from the first. Harker made a sound that suggested disgust. A few people drifted away, the way people do when the confrontation they were hoping for fails to materialize. Warren held Shagrol's gaze and did not move. You don't know me, she said. It was not an accusation. It was closer to a warning, or perhaps a test. No, he agreed. But you shot a clean elk and you are asking for a fair trade, and that is all the knowing I generally need. Something moved in those amber eyes. Quick there and gone, she picked up the elk. Show me this trading post, she said. The interior of Hartley's was shadowy and smelled of pine resin, dried meat, and the particular dusty sweetness of grain. Old Hartley himself was behind the counter, and his expression when they came through the door was complicated. But Warren was already talking, laying out the terms of trade in the patient, reasonable way he had developed over years of negotiating between stubborn men and difficult circumstances. And Hartley, who was fundamentally a practical man, eventually agreed. Shagrol stood to one side while the arrangement was made, taking in the shelves, the hanging tools, the jars of preserves and coils of rope. She did not touch anything. She was very still in the way that large, capable things are still, not passive but contained. When it was done and Hartley had produced the salt, the cord, and a good flint steel striker sealed in a waxcloth pouch, Shagrol gathered them and turned to the door. Then she stopped. Why did you do that? She asked, not looking at Warren, looking at the door. Warren considered this honestly. Because Harker was being unreasonable, and I generally find unreasonable people difficult to leave unaddressed. She glanced back at him. That is not a real answer. No, he admitted. I suppose it is not. The real answer is that you were standing out there alone in front of a crowd, and you had done nothing wrong, and I have spent enough of my life watching wrong go unchallenged. He paused. That is probably the truest thing I can tell you. She studied him for a moment that stretched out long enough to be uncomfortable, though Warren had the feeling she found silence more comfortable than most. Shagrol Strongtusk, she said finally. It was not quite an offer of friendship, but it was something. Warren Winslow, he said. She nodded once as though filing it away. Then she pushed through the door and walked out into the afternoon, and he watched her go and thought, somewhat against his own expectations, that he hoped she came back. She did not come back for 6 days. Warren had his hands full in those 6 days regardless. He was a trapper by trade, though he farmed a modest plot beside the cabin he had built 3 years ago at the edge of the tree line north of Duskfall, where the frontier pressed close, and the nights grew wild with wolves and the sound of wind through old pines. He ran a long trap line east along the river, checked it every 2 days, processed and stretched hides in the linta beside the cabin, and sold pelts to Hartley at the end of each week. It was a solitary life. He did not mind it mostly. He was 27, and had spent enough years in the denser, noisier parts of the world to know that he was better suited to the quiet ones. On the 6th evening, when the light was long and amber through the trees, and he was kneeling by the fire pit turning a spit of river trout, he heard footsteps in the undergrowth that were too deliberate to be an animal. He did not reach for the rifle leaning against the cabin wall, but he was aware of its location in the particular way of a man who lives alone in a place that occasionally requires such awareness. Shagrol came out of the trees carrying a bundle of gray pelts over one arm and a dead wild pig over the other shoulder, which was, Warren thought, a very Shagrol Strongtusk way to arrive somewhere. My camp is 3 miles east, she said by way of greeting, setting the pig down near his fire pit with the kind of practicality that presumed permission without asking for it. The cord and salt are good, the striker is excellent. Glad to hear it, Warren said, and meant it. She crouched on the other side of the fire, not warming her hands, just settling, and looked at the trout. You overturned the spit twice, she said. The underside is still raw. He looked at the trout. He had, in fact, only turned it once. I was thinking, he said. About what? Whether you would come back, he admitted. She looked at him across the fire. In the orange light, her green skin had a warm depth to it, and her amber eyes caught the flame so they looked almost like actual amber, like resin with something caught inside. I did not decide to come back, she said. I needed to speak to a person who operates in this town, and you are the only one I know. Fair enough, Warren said. What do you need? A place to process these pelts. My camp does not have the tools. He gestured toward the lean-to. Stretching frames are in there. You can use them. She looked at the lean-to, then at him. You do not know me, she said again, as she had in the trading post. You said that last time, he said. And I gave you the same answer I am giving you now, which is that you have not done anything that would make me want to withhold tools from you. She made a sound that was not quite a grunt and not quite a laugh, something in between, and pushed herself upright and went to the lean-to. They worked side by side in the fading evening, him on the trout and later on a saddle of venison from yesterday's hunt, her on the pelts with the quick, efficient movements of someone who had been doing this since they could walk. The silence between them was not empty. It was the kind of silence that exists between people who are comfortable with their own thoughts, but not disinterested in the other person's presence. The pig went over the fire after dark and they ate without ceremony, pulling meat off the bone and eating with their hands, and Shagrol told him in pieces that she was traveling south from her clan's territory in the high mountain passes, carrying trade goods, looking for routes into markets that did not require her to go through the Orc territories to the west, where 3 clans were fighting a territorial war that was blocking all the passes. And your clan? Warren asked. The Strongtusk clan. Her face closed slightly. It was not dramatic, just a subtle tightening around the jaw, a quieting of the eyes. My clan as well, she said, in a way that did not invite further inquiry on that particular subject. He did not press. How long until the western passes open? No one knows. Could be spring, could be longer. She looked at the fire. I need to move products south before the river freezes. If I cannot sell through the mountain routes, I need to find another way. The wagon trail through Reedmouth, Warren said. It is rough country and the tolls are steep, but it is open year-round. She was quiet for a moment. I have heard of Reedmouth. I go down in 3 weeks with the full season's catch, he said. If you want a traveling companion, you are welcome to it. 2 people are safer than 1 on that trail. She looked at him then, a long, searching look, and he held it without looking away, which he had the feeling was something she was paying attention to. We will see, she said. She left before dawn, and when he woke the stretching frames were clean and returned to their place in the lean-to, and the fire had been banked with the efficient tidiness of someone used to leaving no trace. He smiled at that, alone in the morning, and began his day. She came back 4 days later and then 3 days after that, and by the 3rd visit they had developed a rhythm so natural it might have been rehearsed. She brought game and pelts. He provided tools, salt, fire, and the kind of company that did not demand anything of her. They ate and worked and talked, and the talking expanded as trust did, in careful increments. He learned that the Strongtusk clan held a high pass that connected 2 mountain ranges, and that they had held it for 5 generations through a combination of military strength and strategic pragmatism that he could only admire. He learned that she was 25 and had been a trader for her clan for 3 years, traveling alone through human and mixed territories, handling negotiations that required her to hold her ground against people who began every interaction assuming she was dangerous and ended most of them respecting her thoroughly. He learned that she had 2 brothers, one older and one younger, and that her mother was the clan elder, a woman called Morg Strongtusk, who was by every account extraordinary. He did not learn, for a long time, much of anything personal. She spoke of practical things, logistical things, things of trade and territory, and the mechanics of survival in a hard landscape. She did not speak of feelings or fears or hopes. She had the personality of someone who had been taught, perhaps in the most literal sense, that interiority was private, that interior experience was not a thing to be aired. He noticed this with the gentle attention of a man who does not push, who waits for things to come to him as he had learned patience from a life spent checking trap lines, moving quietly through forests, reading the signs the world offers when you are not making noise. On her 5th visit she arrived in the rain, soaked through, and stood at his door with water running off her braids and said nothing for a moment. "Come in," he said. She came in. He built up the fire and found a spare wool blanket, heavy and worn but dry, and held it out to her. She took it and wrapped it around her shoulders and stood close to the fire, and he busied himself with getting the kettle on and producing a meal from what he had available, which was black bean soup and cornbread, and enough dried venison to make it substantial. They sat on either side of the fire, inside now because of the rain lashing the single window, and ate in the comfortable silence that had become characteristic of their time together. The firelight played across the angles of her face, her high cheekbones, the elegant curve of her tusks, the thoughtful set of her brows. The blanket had slipped from one shoulder, and she had not rearranged it, apparently indifferent to the cold in the way that orcs sometimes were, and Warren found himself noticing the quality of her stillness, the way she inhabited her body without self-consciousness, the way she sat straight, grounded, as if she were always ready for whatever came next. He realized somewhere around the second bowl of soup, experiencing something he had not experienced in a considerable amount of time, which was the specific and clarifying feeling of wanting very much to be someone's reason for being somewhere. He said nothing about this. He was a patient man. "My mother says," Shagrol said suddenly, out of what seemed like nothing, "that grief is a luxury, that the Strongtusk do not waste themselves on it." Warren looked at her. She was looking at the fire. "Does she mean it?" he asked. "She means every word she has ever said," Shagrol replied. "She is not a woman who says things she does not mean." "That is not quite the same as being right," Warren said. Shagrol glanced at him. Then she looked back at the fire. She was quiet for a long time. Long enough that he thought she was simply going to let the topic close. "My father died last winter," she said. "Fever. It was very fast." He let the silence hold that for a moment before he spoke. "I am sorry," he said simply, without ornamentation. "He was 42, she said. "In good health. It was unexpected." Her jaw was tight. "We did not weep at his passing. My mother stood at his pyre and her face was stone, and my brothers and I stood the same way because that is what the Strongtusk do. We are not a clan that weeps." She paused. "People said it was strength." "Was it?" he asked quietly. Her hands, wrapped around the bowl, tightened very slightly. "I do not know," she said, and that answer seemed to cost her something real. He did not tell her what he believed about that because she had not asked. But he kept his eyes on the fire so she did not have to manage being looked at while she was vulnerable, and he stayed where he was, close enough that she knew she was not alone, far enough that she had room. The rain hammered the cabin roof. The fire crackled. She stayed the night, sleeping in the chair nearest the fire with the blanket around her shoulders and her knife on the table beside her, a very Shagrol Strongtusk way of sleeping. And Warren lay on his cot on the other side of the room, and listened to her breathing slow, and even out, and thought about her father's pyre, and a woman of 25 standing straight-backed before a fire with a face like stone, while everything inside her burned. When he woke she was gone again. But the soup pot had been cleaned and the bowls stacked and the fire banked, and on the table beside where she had slept was a small carving, a river stone no bigger than his thumb worn smooth by water, with one of the small geometric marks he had noticed on her cord of silver beads scratched into its surface with the tip of a knife. He turned it over in his fingers for a long time before he set it on the shelf above the window. The following week was when Duskfall's autumn market opened, a 3-day affair, when farmers and trappers and craftspeople from a wide, surrounding radius came into town to sell and trade and gather provisions before the deeper cold set in. Warren attended as he always did, with a wagon load of prime pelts and a modest arrangement of smoked and dried meat. He set up his usual spot in the market row and spent the first morning in productive business, which left his mind free enough to notice when Shagrol arrived. She had walked in from the east along the wagon road, which meant she had walked from her camp, which was in the hills beyond the tree line. She was carrying 2 large packs, and her amber eyes were doing the same calculation they had done the first day, reading the crowd, measuring the resistance. There was more resistance today. The autumn market drew people from further out, people who had no memory of Warren's intervention 3 weeks ago, people for whom the sight of a lone orc woman walking into a human market was simply an affront without context. He watched a group of men near the butcher's corner turn and clock her arrival, watched the body language change, watched the decision form. He was off his stool and moving before any of them had actually done anything, because he had spent enough time reading situations to know which way they were going to fall. The group, 4 of them, farmhands from the look of their coats and boots, were already moving to intercept her by the time he came around the end of his stall and put himself in the road between them and her, 3 feet in front of her position. "Gentlemen," he said, at a volume that was not loud but carried in the particular way that a person carries who is entirely calm. The lead man, broad and florid-faced, stopped. His eyes moved from Warren to Shagrol and back. "You know this creature," he said. Warren felt, very specifically, the hard, cold clarity that settles over a person when they have made a decision, and all the noise goes quiet. "Name," he said, "is Shagrol Strongtusk, and she is here to trade at the market same as everyone else." "This is a human market," the man said. "No," Warren said. "It is a market, it does not specify." He held the man's gaze. "And I would like you to think carefully before you take another step in her direction, because I am not going to let you take it, and I would rather not spend the rest of this market explaining to the town elder why there was a brawl." The 4 men looked at each other. Warren heard Shagrol behind him, completely still, and had the fleeting, vivid thought that she was entirely capable of handling 4 farmhands without assistance, and that she was letting him do this not because she needed it, but because she was watching what he would do. The lead man muttered something cutting, spat in the road, and turned away. The others followed. Around them, the market had gone quiet again. In that way it had. That collective held breath, and Warren turned back to Shagrol. Her expression was very difficult to read. It was not soft, but it was attentive in a way that felt precise. "You do that a great deal," she said. "Have arguments in roads," he said. "Stand in front of things," she said. He thought about that. "Someone has to," he said. She held his gaze for 1 beat too, and then she said, "Show me which stalls deal fairly." And he turned and walked with her through the market, and something in the arrangement of the day felt, to him, like a shift in a door that had been slowly, carefully, swinging open. She sold her pelts, exceptional quality, which the leather worker from Oakhaven acknowledged with professional gratitude and cash payment, and bought the supplies she needed. Warren introduced her to Merritt and to Rue and to a few others he trusted, and in each case he watched Shagrol deploy the same careful, measured competence she brought to everything, earning in 30 minutes of transaction what it might take most people weeks to build. At midday they sat on the edge of his wagon and ate from a bundle of food he had packed that morning: hard cheese, dried fruit, cornbread, and the October sun was thin but warm on their backs. "The road to Reedmouth," she said. "You leave in a week." "Roughly," he said. She took a piece of cornbread. "I will travel with you." He kept his expression steady. "I am glad to hear it." She glanced at him sideways, and there it was again, that thing he had started watching for, that almost smile that lived in the corner of her mouth and barely arrived before it was gone, like a bird landing on a fence rail and lifting away before you can be sure you saw it. They left on a Tuesday under a sky the color of old pewter, the wagon loaded and Shagrol walking alongside with her packs because she refused twice to ride in the wagon, and Warren eventually stopped asking. The trail south to Reedmouth was 4 days of hard travel through rough country, dense pine forest giving way to rock and scrub, the trail narrowing through canyon walls before it opened again to flatter, wetter land near the river crossing. It was, in every way, excellent traveling time. They talked more on the road than they had talked in all the previous weeks together, because the road demanded conversation the way an empty room demands furniture. It was either that or silence, and they had already spent enough of their early acquaintance in silence to have developed an appetite for the other thing. She told him about the clan's trading network, which was sophisticated and far-reaching. He told her about his years before Duskfall time spent east in the river towns, a brief ill-advised season as a guide for a merchant caravan that had ended in misfortune he described with dry humor, and eventually the northward drift that had brought him to the frontier. She laughed for the first time on the second day at the story of the merchant caravan and the particularly disastrous river crossing, and it was not a polite laugh, it was a real one, sudden and unguarded, low and warm, and it startled him enough that he momentarily lost track of what he had been saying. She noticed. "You went quiet," she said. "I was just appreciating the laugh," he said honestly. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said with a very deliberate flatness that he was beginning to recognize as her version of shyness, "I do not laugh often." "I noticed," he said, and then, careful as stepping on ice he was not sure of, "You should have to more." Another silence. Not uncomfortable, just long. On the third day the trail climbed sharply through a pine canyon and the wind came down from the peaks carrying ice in it, and Warren's horses were struggling with the grade and the loaded wagon. Shagrol, without a word, moved to the lead horse's bridle and walked with it, steadying and guiding with a complete easy authority that the horse accepted immediately, and they made the grade in better time than Warren would have managed alone. That evening they made camp at a good flat spot above the canyon, built a fire between two granite outcroppings that caught the wind, and ate hot food, and were quiet with the specific comfortable quiet of people who have spent 3 days in each other's company and no longer feel required to fill every silence. She had her bedroll on the other side of the fire. He was on his. The stars were extraordinary, the high clear stars you only get this far from any settlement with nothing between you and the sky. "The geometric mark," he said, "on the stone you left. What does it mean?" She looked at the fire for a moment. "In my language it means something like given freely," she said. "It is what you mark on a thing that is a gift rather than a trade." He thought about that. "You gave it to me," he said. "Yes," she said. "Why?" She was quiet for a long moment. The fire crackled. An owl called somewhere in the dark pines above them. "Because you stood in the road," she said finally, "and you did not ask anything of me for it." He looked at the fire too. The warmth of it was good and real against the cold. He thought about reaching across and taking her hand, and did not, because it was not time yet and he knew the difference. "You can leave things with me," he said. "Any time you want." The fire crackled. The owl called again. "I know," she said, and in those 2 words he heard something that he did not name because naming it would have been rushing it, but he felt it in his chest like a struck bell going on resonating after the hammer had lifted. Reedmouth was a hard-edged river town with a trading post the size of a small barn, and a tavern that never fully closed, and a dock where flat-bottomed river boats loaded and unloaded cargo for the southern markets. It was not friendly to orcs, which was a fact Shagrol stated plainly the moment they came down off the last hill and saw the town spread along the river bend below. "I know," Warren said. "I have been here before," she said. "They refused me entry to the trading post." "Who refused you?" he asked. She described the post keeper, a thick-necked man with a reputation Warren knew by name. He thought for a moment. "Then we do this differently," he said. "You tell me exactly what you need to sell and what you need to buy. I will go in and negotiate. Then you meet me at the dock and we do the handoff there." She looked at him. "That is my business to conduct," she said, and there was an edge to it, not angry but firm, a woman who did not like to need proxies. "I know," he said. "I am not suggesting I replace you. I am suggesting a workaround for a situation we both know will otherwise cost you time and money and more patience than that man deserves." He paused. "The outcome is still yours. I am just the tool that gets you in the door." A long pause. She looked at the town, then at him. "I dislike this," she said. "So do I," he said. "But I dislike you losing more." Something shifted in her expression. Then she said with deliberate calm, "The pelts are prime winter gray and black, 23 skins. I will take market price or near to it. I need 60 feet of good rope, 6 pounds of salt pork, 2 wool blankets, lamp oil good quality, not the cheap river-reed oil, and steel arrowheads, 2 dozen. He repeated it back to her precisely. She corrected one thing, the arrowhead count should be 30, and he nodded. The negotiation inside the trading post was lengthy and involved the post keeper's instinctive resistance softening under the weight of Warren's patient insistence and the obvious quality of the pelts. And by the end of it, Warren had secured a fair price, a little under what he had hoped, but above what Shagrol had said was the floor. At the dock she counted the rope and salt pork and blankets and lamp oil and arrowheads with quick, expert hands and said nothing for a moment when she finished. "You got 32 arrowheads," she said. "He threw in 2 extra to close the deal," Warren said. She looked at the count again, then at him. And the almost smile came back, and this time it stayed a half-second longer before it went. They spent 2 nights in Reedmouth, in separate rooms at the tavern, a transaction that required Warren to do some additional managing of the landlord's reflexive objections, which he handled with the same quiet firmness, and which cost him slightly more than the room should have. He did not mention the extra cost to Shagrol. He would have mentioned it to himself as a complaint later, lying on the narrow tavern bed staring at the ceiling, except that thinking about Shagrol made him forget to be annoyed about anything. On the second night in Reedmouth, there was a confrontation at the dock. They had been there in the early evening, checking on the wagon which he had left under a lean-to near the boat landing, and a group of 3 men, not drunks, worse, the sober and committed kind of hostile, had come around the corner of the dock building and stopped at the sight of Shagrol with the very visible intention of saying something about it. What happened next was one of those moments that Warren would remember in precise physical detail for the rest of his life. The lead man pulled a long knife. Not with any specific threat, just the lazy confidence of a man demonstrating that he had won and was not afraid to make his point visible. He said something about orcs and what they were worth and what should be done with them in territory that belonged to human people. Shagrol turned to face him. She did not reach for her own knife. She stood with her feet planted and her shoulders squared and looked at the man with an absolute stillness that was, frankly, more intimidating than anything she could have done with a weapon. Warren stepped forward, placing himself to her left, not in front of her. He had learned by now that standing in front of her read as an insult, but beside her, his hand on the rifle on his back, which he had not raised and did not raise but which was visible. "You should put that away," Warren said to the knife man. "This is not your fight, trapper," the man said. "And yet here I am," Warren said. "Funny how that works." The standoff stretched for 10-15 seconds of that absolute charged stillness that only exists in moments where the whole situation could go either way. Then the man with the knife looked at Shagrol's face and at Warren's face and did the calculation of what kind of damage this specific pair of people would do if this went physical, and he put the knife away. They left. Their footsteps retreated along the dock. The river moved dark and quick beside them. Warren let out a slow breath. He became aware that Shagrol's hand was on his arm. She had put it there at some point during the standoff, her hand on his forearm, fingers curled around the wool of his coat sleeve. She was looking at where the men had gone. Then she became aware that he had noticed, and she let go of his arm and looked at the river instead. "You did not need to stand there," she said. "I know," he said. "You keep doing it anyway," she said. "I know," he said again. And then quietly, "Shagrol." She turned and looked at him. In the dock lamplight her eyes were very amber, very direct, and full of something she had not yet named. "I am not going anywhere," he said, simply. As though it were just a fact about the weather. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, just as simply, "I see that," and turned back to the river, and they stood side by side in the lamplight with the cold river running past them, and the night folding in around them and his arm warm where her hand had been. The journey back north was 4 days again, and colder, the first serious cold of the season settling in on the second day as a sky-darkening front moved down from the peaks and brought with it a light snow that coated the pine branches and turned the trail to pale mud. On the third night, Shagrol's fire would not hold. The wood was wet and the wind was working against her, and she had been trying for 20 minutes with the flint steel striker. The good one, the one he had helped her get in Duskfall, when he came around from where he had been setting up his side of the camp and without asking crouched beside her, and took the striker and the char cloth, and showed her a technique with the hands cupped that blocked the wind at the crucial moment. The fire caught. He built it up carefully, and she watched him and said nothing for a moment. "You have small hands for a trapper," she said. He looked at his hands. They were not small, they were average-sized, but he understood she was deploying this as a deflection because he had just done something quietly useful and she was not sure how to receive it. "They are the right size for the job I have," he said. She made that not-quite-laugh sound. They sat by the fire in the gathering snow, close enough that their shoulders were near touching, both of them eating from the same pot of salt pork stew he had made because the conditions were not good for cooking separately, and he had suggested simply making one large pot, and she had agreed without much discussion. Sharing a pot felt, he thought, like something, like a step. The snow thickened overnight. By morning, they had 4 inches of wet, heavy snow on everything, and the trail ahead was going to be slow going with the loaded wagon and the horses who did not love snow. They broke camp efficiently, working alongside each other with the practiced coordination of people who had now spent enough time in each other's company to move around each other without narration. Partway through breaking camp, his hands numb with cold, he fumbled the tie on one of the wagon's canvas covers, and it came loose and started to flap in the wind. Shagrol caught it. She caught it without looking, already moving past him for something else, one hand snapping out and grabbing the canvas edge with the same reflexive accuracy with which she caught everything, and she turned and handed it back to him, and their hands met around the canvas and stopped. He looked at her. She was very close, closer than usual. She did not let go of the canvas. Neither did he. The snow fell between them and around them, and the horses shifted in their traces, and somewhere in the distance a bird called once in the cold gray air, and neither of them moved. "Warren," she said. "Yes," he said. "I do not," she stopped. She was looking at their hands on the canvas, then at his face. "I am not certain what to do with you," she said. "You could do nothing," he said, "and I would still be here." She looked at him for another of those long moments that he had come to understand were not hesitation, but rather her version of thoroughness, of checking something from every angle before she committed. And then she said, quietly and with a certain deliberate weight, "That is the problem." He understood her. She was not saying he was a problem. She was saying that the fact of him, steady and present and not going anywhere, and not asking anything, and standing in roads and sharing cooking pots, and catching canvas in the cold, was doing something to her that she did not have a category for. That the Strongtusk clan did not weep, and possibly, it followed, the Strongtusk clan did not have a category for this specific thing either. He let go of the canvas carefully, and she tied it off with quick fingers, and they hitched the team and started north through the snow, and he did not push it, because patience was not just a strategy with him. It was a genuine virtue, one of the few he was entirely certain he had. But he thought about her hands around the canvas, and he thought about it for a long time. They got back to Duskfall in deteriorating weather and parted ways with a practicality that had become their mode. She took her share of the Reedmouth sales, which he accounted for honestly and paid in full, and shouldered her packs. 3 miles east, she said, as she had said the first time. "I know," he said. She looked at him. Snow in her braids, canvas strap across one shoulder. "The winter will be long," she said. "Yes," he said, a pause. "My camp will not hold in deep snow," she said. "The pass south is already closing. The western passes are still blocked." He waited. "I may need to winter somewhere with a real structure," she said, in a tone so studiedly practical it might as well have been announcing a commercial transaction. "I have a cabin," he said. "It is small, but the chimney is good and the roof is sound, and I built the north wall double thick because I knew what winters were up here." She nodded, very gravely, as though this were all simply logistical and had nothing to do with anything else. "I will think about it," she said. She came back 2 days later with everything she owned, which was 2 large packs, a set of bow hunting equipment, a folded hide bedroll, a series of small carved items wrapped in cloth that she placed on the shelf above the east window with the same care one gives to valuable things, and a specific and practical attitude about the entire situation that dared him to read anything personal into it. He didn't. He just moved the second chair closer to the fire and put an extra cup on the table and did not say a word about any of it. They wintered together. It was the strangest and most profoundly affecting thing that had happened to Warren Winslow in 27 years of living. The cabin was small, one main room, a sleeping loft reached by a ladder, and the lean-to attached. He gave her the loft without discussion because it had better insulation and a proper pine-bough mattress, and because he preferred the cot near the fire anyway, and it would have been absurd to suggest she take the cot and him the loft. She accepted this without sentiment. The days had a rhythm. He ran the trap line. She hunted or worked on gear or managed the food stores with an organizational precision that actually improved on his system significantly. They cooked together in the evenings with an easy division of labor that became so natural he stopped consciously noticing it. They talked. They read. He had a shelf of books, navigation manuals, and a natural history of the Northern Territories, and 2 novels that had come with the cabin when he bought it from the previous trapper. And she worked through them with the intensity of someone who has always had strong opinions about things and finds books a reliable source of additional things to have opinions about. She had very good opinions about things. She thought the natural history was mostly wrong about orc biology, which was accurate. She thought one of the novels was remarkably good and the other was self-indulgent, which Warren agreed with. She had opinions about trapping routes and preserving techniques, and weather patterns and the failings of frontier governance that were all incisive and well-reasoned. And she delivered them in that measured low voice, with the absolute conviction of a woman who had learned to be certain of her positions, because uncertainty had costs she could not afford. He loved listening to her talk. That word "loved" was one he turned over carefully by himself at night, lying on the cot with the fire banked low and the wind pressing against the double-thick north wall. It was not a word he used carelessly. He had not used it about a person in a long time, and the last time he had used it things had not gone especially well, which had contributed to the northward drift and the trapping cabin and the solitary life. He looked at it honestly. Yes, he thought, that is what this is. The question was what to do with it, which, for a patient man, was actually less complicated than it might have been for someone else. He did not need to do anything with it. He needed to simply continue being who he was and let the thing breathe and trust Shagrol to find her own way to it in her own time. It was November when he saw her cry. He had not expected it. She had given him no reason to. The previous 2 months had been good months, full of a warmth and ease and humor that he would not have predicted from that first silent standoff in Duskfall's Market Road. He had come in from the trap line early because a front was moving in fast, and the sky over the eastern ridge had that green-gray look that meant serious weather. He had come in quietly because he was cold and tired, and his boots were wet. She was standing at the east window, facing it, looking at the shelf where she had placed her carved items. She had not heard him come in. And she was absolutely still, in that way she had, except that her shoulders were not held straight in their usual way. They were curved slightly inward as though she were protecting something. He saw very clearly in the pale winter light through the window the line of tears on her green cheek. Not many. One trail on each side, slow and controlled even in grief, as though the Strongtusk training went down deep enough to regulate even this. One of the carved items on the shelf was in her hands. He could not see what it was from the door, but he could see how she held it, with both hands close to her chest, like something irreplaceable. He stood very still in the doorway for a moment. Then he backed up silently, pulled the door shut, made a deliberate amount of noise with his boots on the porch step, and came in again normally, stamping snow off his feet and calling out that the sky was going dark fast. By the time he was through the door, she was at the fire, adding wood, her back to him, the carved item returned to the shelf, her face hidden. When she turned around, she was herself again, composed, ready. "You are back early," she said. "Weather's turning," he said, hanging up his coat. "Going to be a bad one. I put extra wood inside," she said, "and the horses are in the lean-to." "Good thinking," he said. He went to the kettle and got it over the fire. He did not look at her face. He did not make it easy for her to think about whether he had noticed. He simply was there, warm and ordinary, and he held the knowledge of what he had seen quietly inside himself as the most private thing he owned. He never told her he had seen it. He never told her because he understood what it had cost her, what it would cost her, the woman from the clan that did not weep. And he understood that she would not thank him for it, not because she was proud in a foolish way, but because that particular moment had been hers, her grief, her father's carved remembrance, her quiet private falling down and gathering herself back up. To speak of it would be to take something from her. And he was not a man who took things from people. But he put her favorite cup closer to the kettle that evening, and he made the soup with extra salt pork the way she preferred it. And when the storm hit and the wind was howling against the north wall, he moved his cot closer to the fire and said nothing when she came down from the loft in the middle of the night and wrapped her bedroll around herself and settled on the rug closer to the heat. "Storm woke me," she said by way of explanation. "The wind is loud," he agreed, which it was. She settled. He lay back on his cot. They were perhaps 4 feet apart, close enough that he could hear her breathing. "Warren," she said in the dark. "Yes," he said. A pause. "Thank you for the soup." He smiled at the ceiling. "Any time," he said. "The storm lasted 3 days." They played at a dice game she taught him involving clan signals, which he was terrible at and she was merciless about. And they cooked elaborate meals from what they had stored. And on the second day she sat on the rug close to the fire and worked on arrow fletching, and he read to her from the natural history book, and she interrupted him periodically with corrections. And it was, he thought, the best 3 days he had ever spent inside a building. On the third day, late in the afternoon when the storm had eased to a sullen gray and the wind had dropped, he was sitting at the table working on a map of his trap line, and she was sitting across from him sharpening her knife, and she looked up and looked at him with a directness that was, he realized, different from her usual directness. "You saw something," she said, "at the window, the day before the storm." He kept his eyes on the map. "I came in early," he said. "Weather was turning." "Warren," she said, his name in her mouth, deliberate and full. He looked up. She was watching him with those amber eyes that were so clear and so searching, and she had the knife down and her hands were still, and she was looking at him with an expression he had not seen before, which was composed of something he could only call trust mixed with a kind of terrified determination. "I do not know," she said slowly, "how to say what I want to say in a way that does not cost too much." "Then say it any way it comes," he said. "I will take care of it." She breathed in, breathed out. "My father's name was Shagrol Strongtusk," she said. "He carved the marker on the shelf. He taught me to carve it myself in case I ever made a thing that was given freely." She was looking at the table now. He would have liked this arrangement. He thought my mother's people were too rigid. He believed in practical comfort. She paused. He used to say that a well-built fire and a person worth talking to were the only luxuries worth pursuing. Warren said nothing. His chest was very full. "I miss him," she said. And she said it in the flat, careful way of someone who is saying a true thing they have not said aloud before, at least not in those precise words. And the flatness is not absence of feeling but the opposite, the measure of how much feeling is being held. "I know," he said, not intrusively, just witnessing it, acknowledging it. She looked at him. "I do not. There is no word in your language for what the Strongtusk call it, the ache, the weight of carrying someone you cannot put down." She paused. "We do not call it grief, we call it carrying. The word means both the weight and the responsibility. You do not put it down, you carry it and you keep moving. He looked at her for a long time, then he said, "That sounds like grief to me. Just the version of it that does not let you stop." She blinked. And something in her face, something behind the composure, behind the steadiness shifted, as though a thing that had been held very tightly had been given, for one moment, permission to be held less tightly. He reached across the table. He put his hand over hers on the table the way he had wanted to do since the canvas in the snow, and he held it there, warm and steady and not requiring anything. She looked at his hand. She turned hers over slowly, and her fingers closed around his, and the grip was strong and certain in the way that everything she did was certain, and she held on. They stayed like that for a long time. The fire burned. The winter pressed against the north wall. Outside, the storm's remnants dragged across the sky. When she finally let go, she picked up her knife and went back to sharpening it, and he went back to his map, and neither of them mentioned it. But things were different after that, subtly and then less subtly. She started sitting closer. Not dramatically, not all at once, just the gradual narrowing of the distance between them on the bench beside the fire, the way that distance tends to close when both people are honest about which direction they want to go. She started touching him in small, incidental ways that he was quite certain were not incidental. A hand on his shoulder when she passed behind him, fingers on his wrist when she wanted to show him something, once the heel of her hand against his back when she guided him around something in the dark lean-to. He touched her back when she allowed it. Her arm when he was making a point, the sleeve of her shirt when they were close together at the fire. Once memorably, he tucked a loose strand of her dark hair back into her braid when it fell across her face during dinner, and his fingers brushed her temple and the tip of her ear, and she went entirely still and looked at him with the most unguarded expression he had ever seen on her face, open and surprised and something very warm, before she looked back at the fire and said nothing but did not pull away. He thought about kissing her every day for approximately 3 weeks. He did not do it. He was not cowardly, he did not think. He was waiting for the right moment, the real one, the one that was not manufactured by proximity or firelight alone but came from something true. He was patient. He could wait. But patience, he was discovering, had its limits. It was January, deep winter, snow thick on the ground, and the days short and the nights very long and cold. They were returning from a walk to the far trap station along the river, 2 miles east, and the walk back was into the wind off the mountains, hard and sharp, and the last half-mile they were both moving quickly with heads down just to stay warm. He opened the cabin door and she came through ahead of him, and the warmth hit them both like a wall, and she turned to say something. He never knew what, because she turned and his hand was on the door and they were very close, closer than usual, and the cold was still on their faces and her eyes came up to his. The almost smile was there, but this time it did not go. He raised his hand from the door and touched her jaw, just the tips of his fingers, the lightest possible contact, a question not a declaration. She turned her face into his hand just fractionally, the smallest possible move. He kissed her. It was soft and careful and brief, barely a breath, and he pulled back and looked at her, and her eyes were open and looking at him with an expression that was as clear and direct as everything else she did. "Again," she said. He kissed her again, and this time it was not brief. It was warm and real, and her hand came up to his chest and held there, and he felt her lean into it, the whole weight of her leaning into it, not delicately but fully in the way she committed to everything, and he put his arm around her and held on. When they broke apart they were both very still. "Well," she said, with a steady voice that was only slightly unsteady. "Yes," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she put her head against his shoulder, just her forehead, just briefly, and he rested his cheek against her hair. Outside the wind was howling. Inside the fire was bright and the cabin was warm, and everything was, for the first time in a very long time for both of them, precisely where it should be. The winter was long, as she had predicted, but it did not feel long. It had a quality he had not experienced before, a sense of rightness, of the days being well spent in good company. They worked and talked and argued and laughed more than either of them had apparently laughed in some years, and every evening by the fire had the weight of something treasured, something both of them knew was rare and intended to preserve carefully. They were tender with each other, not cautious. There was nothing timid about either of them, but careful, in the way you are careful with things that matter. He learned her, the way she moved through mornings slowly and evenings quickly, the way she always knew exactly where north was, the way she hummed when she worked but stopped immediately if she noticed him listening, the way she held grief and humor in adjacent rooms inside herself and moved between them without announcement. She learned him, the way his patience was not passivity but choice, the way his kindness was not weakness but the most consistent thing about him, the way he made decisions once and fully and then did not revisit them, the way he noticed small things, her preferences, her moods, the things she was not saying, and incorporated them without drawing attention to the fact that he had noticed. On a night in late February, a night so cold and clear the stars were crystalline and sharply brilliant through the window, the warmth between them that had been building since January gathered itself into something that could not be put off any longer and did not need to be. He was on the cot and she had been in the loft, and she came down the ladder in the deep night and he was already awake, which suggested he had known she would come, or had hoped. She did not make it into a question. She sat on the edge of the cot beside him and looked at him in the dark, and he reached up and found her hand. What passed between them was not rushed. It had the quality of something deeply earned. The whole long autumn of it, the roads and markets and storms and conversations, the held hands and the almost smile and the winter evenings and the first kiss and every small careful thing, all of it settling into a single warm, unhurried arrival. He pulled her close, and she came into his arms with the same fullness with which she leaned into a kiss, completely, without reservation, and he pressed his lips to her temple and her cheek and the corner of her jaw, and she made a sound low in her chest that undid him in the best possible way. The night was very long and very warm, and the stars were still sharp when they slept, his arm around her and her head on his chest, and he lay in the dark listening to her breathe and thought, "I am keeping this," and closed his eyes. Spring came with the drama spring has in high country, violent snowmelt and flooded lowlands, and then sudden extraordinary warmth, and the world opening up green and loud with returning birds. Shagrol's pass to the south opened in late March, and her pass through the western mountains opened in April, which meant the roads were clear and the world was moving again. She did not leave. She did not announce that she was staying. She simply did not go, in the same way she had not gone all winter, and Warren understood that for Shagrol Strongtusk this was the most complete declaration of anything she was going to make, and he treasured it accordingly. In April she had a message from her clan, carried south by a Strongtusk rider, a young man of perhaps 18 who arrived at the cabin with the wariness of someone expecting a bad reception, and left with a full meal inside him, and a genuine expression of confusion about what kind of human man this was. The message was from her mother, Morg Strongtusk, and it was written in the Strongtusk clan script that Shagrol read quickly with a face that gave away less than nothing. When she finished reading, she folded the letter. "My mother wants to know if I am coming back to the pass," she said. Warren waited. "She says the clan needs its trade runner," she said. "She says the Western Territory is stabilizing and the passes will be more profitable next season. She says," a pause, "that she has heard from the Reedmouth Post keeper that I was seen traveling south with a human trapper, and she wants to know what that means." "What does it mean?" Warren asked. She looked at him. "I would like to know what you think it means," she said, in a tone that was absolutely Shagrol, direct and simultaneously protected, asking the question while bracing for the answer. "It means," he said, "that I would like you to stay if you are willing, and that if staying means your clan needs to understand the situation, I am prepared to go north and explain it to them." She was very still. You would go to my clan's territory, to talk to your mother, yes. She is not an easy woman, she said. She does not like humans in her territory. She will not accept that I am. She stopped. That we are. What are we? He asked, gently, not pushing, just asking. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said in a clear, deliberate voice, you are mine and I am yours if you want that. I want that, he said. She nodded once slowly as though resolving something internal. Then you will need to come north, she said, and you will need to not be intimidated. I have had 3 winters of Duskfall's market opinion, he said. I am not easily intimidated. The trip north to Strongtusk territory was 6 days through landscape that got wilder and more dramatic with every day's travel, the trail climbing into the high passes where the mountains were close and enormous, and the air thin enough to ache. Shagrol moved through it with an ease that was clearly homecoming, and Warren watched her change as they climbed. She opened somehow, expanded, shed the specific tightness that came from operating in human territory where she was always being read wrong, and became someone even larger than she already was. The Strongtusk encampment was in a broad natural bowl between 2 peaks, sheltered from the worst of the wind, and it was larger than Warren had expected, a collection of hide tents and stone-walled structures, smoke rising from multiple fires, the smell of cured leather and horses and wood smoke. People stopped what they were doing when Shagrol came through the entry pass, and Warren felt the collective weight of a great many pairs of eyes, many of them very green and very unimpressed by what they were looking at. Shagrol walked straight through the camp without acknowledging any of it, which he had to admire, and stopped in front of the largest structure, a combination of stone base and heavy hide roof, and called out in Orcish something that he did not speak, but which had the cadence of a formal announcement. Morg Strongtusk came out of the structure. She was not what Warren had pictured. She was shorter than Shagrol, broader, with a face that was a generation older version of her daughter's face, the same high bones, the same amber eyes, but set with a gravity that had no give in it at all. Her tusks were longer than Shagrol's, and one of them had an old crack near the base that spoke to some ancient violence. She was perhaps 50 and looked like someone who had spent all 50 years winning. She looked at Warren with the calm, complete assessment of a woman who has been evaluating threats her entire life. This is the human, she said, in accented but precise common tongue. His name is Warren Winslow, Shagrol said. He is a trapper and homesteader from Duskfall, North Country. He is, she paused, and the pause was enormous, mine. Something moved across Morg Strongtusk's face, very controlled but there. Come inside, she said. The conversation lasted 2 hours. Warren spoke when he was addressed, which was less often than he might have expected, because most of what Morg Strongtusk wanted to understand she got from watching him interact with Shagrol, which he understood and did not object to. He told her his situation honestly, the cabin, the trap line, the modest farm he intended to expand in the spring, the life he had built north of Duskfall. He told her that he understood this was unusual, and that he did not expect her approval to be quickly given, and that if she needed time to form her opinion, he would not rush her. Morg Strongtusk looked at him when he said this with an expression he could not entirely read. Then she looked at Shagrol. He speaks without performance, she said in Orcish, apparently to Shagrol. Shagrol, he noted, did not translate this. He took that as a hopeful sign. They stayed 3 days in the clan territory. Warren spent the days under the low-key scrutiny of various clan members, none of whom were warm and most of whom were at least professionally polite. He helped with tasks when it was natural to. He fixed a wheel on a supply cart that had a bent spoke, which required only tools and patience, and the elder who watched him do it made no comment but nodded in a way that felt like a minor passing grade. He sat through a clan meal and ate what was set before him without comment and answered questions from Shagrol's younger brother Drath, who was 20 and curious, and barely concealed his fascination with a human man who was apparently brave enough or foolish enough to winter with his sister. She is not easy to live with, Drath said confidentially. She is, Warren said. "She is only difficult if you are doing something wrong." Drath stared at him. Then he laughed, a loud, startled laugh, and Warren felt the dinner table's tension drop several degrees. On the third morning, Strongtusk found Warren alone at the camp's eastern edge where he had gone to look at the view of the pass in early light. She stood beside him without preamble, and they both looked at the mountains for a moment. "My daughter was born knowing her own mind," Morg said finally. "She has never done a thing she did not fully choose." "No," Warren agreed. "I believe that." "She chose to stay the winter," Morg said. "She chose to come north to introduce you. These are not small things in Strongtusk custom." "I know," he said. "She explained some of it." Morg was quiet for a moment. "You are not afraid of me," she said. "Respectful," he corrected. "That is different." The corner of Morg's mouth did something that he recognized immediately, because it was the same thing Shagrol's mouth did, the almost smile that barely arrived. "She will not come back to the past to live," Morg said. "I know this already. She will come back to trade," he said, "and to see her family. The roads will always be open for that so long as I have any say." Morg looked at him for a long, direct moment. Then she said, "If you hurt her, I will not," he said. Not as a promise of perfection, but as a statement of what he intended and had spent the whole winter demonstrating. "But if I do, I will not need you to address it. She is entirely capable of that herself." Morg looked at him. Then she said in Orcish, something short. He did not know what it meant, but he had the strong impression it was not unfavorable. They returned south in May, and summer came to the frontier country around Duskfall with its full extravagant force, long hot days, and wild thunderstorms off the mountains, and the land green and loud with everything growing at once. Warren put in a larger garden than he had in previous years, and Shagrol helped with a practical energy that transformed the plot from adequate to genuinely good. Her understanding of growing things superior to his in ways she attributed to the mountain territory, where you had to work harder and smarter against a shorter season. They went to Duskfall's summer market together, which was the first time they had appeared in town together in any sustained way, and the response was complicated in the way the frontier always complicated things. There were people who looked away, people who had opinions they announced without being asked, and people who simply did the business of their day and extended the same professional courtesy to Shagrol that they extended to anyone who had a fair product at a fair price. Rue's husband Garrett the blacksmith, who had an enormous and respected presence in town, stopped at their stall and bought 2 prime pelts and shook Warren's hand and nodded to Shagrol with complete straightforward respect, and his willingness to do it in the middle of the market road where everyone could see was worth, Warren thought, more than any argument. Clement Harker made a comment from across the road that Warren heard and did not respond to, because some things were beneath the cost of engagement, and Shagrol, who also heard it, looked at Warren and said, "He does that because your ignoring him is better punishment than your attention would be." And Warren thought, yes, she is right, and felt the specific pleasure of being understood. Summer gave way to the second autumn, and the second autumn was different from the first in every important way. The first autumn they had been strangers, becoming tentative allies, becoming friends. This autumn they were 2 people who had chosen each other and were building something together with the deliberate and unhurried care of people who intend it to last. He had drawn up an amendment to his homestead claim. The frontier settlements had a formal process for this, which now listed 2 occupants and expanded the land claim accordingly. He had done this with the assistance of the land keeper in Duskfall, who was a careful, scrupulous man and had processed the paperwork without comment, though Warren knew the comment was happening elsewhere. He did not especially care. Shagrol had her own formal arrangement now with Hartley's trading post, a standing trade agreement negotiated fair and documented in writing, which gave her the professional standing in town that protected against the reflexive hostility better than any argument. Warren had suggested this not as charity but as good strategy, and she had implemented it with characteristic speed and precision. In October, on a Thursday, she found him at the table in the evening and sat across from him with an expression that he could now read reasonably well, which was to say, she had something significant to say and was organizing how to say it. He closed the book he was reading and gave her his full attention. "I'm going to have a child," she said. He looked at her for a moment. She was watching him with the amber eyes that were, behind the composure, working very hard to hold steady. "Ours," he said, not in doubt, he knew perfectly well, but because the word ours was one he wanted to say. "Yes," she said, "obviously." He reached across the table and took her hands and held them and said, "Good." She looked at his hands holding hers. Then she looked up. "Good," she repeated, and it came out slightly unsteady, slightly uncertain, in the way of someone who had prepared for various responses and not quite prepared for simple. "I am very glad," he said, more precisely. Her hands tightened on his. "I will need to tell my mother," she said. "Yes," he said. "We will go north in the spring." She looked at him. The almost smile came, and this time it arrived fully, not just the corner of her mouth but her whole face, open and warm and real, the smile he had spent a year working for, and it was, he thought, absolutely worth every bit of the wait. They married in November, which was not a legal ceremony of the frontier courts, but rather a dual arrangement. Warren's side involved a simple pledge before the Duskfall settlement elder with Rue and Garrett as witnesses, which was informal but recognized. Shagrol's side involved a clan rite conducted during their spring visit to Strongtusk, a binding in the Strongtusk tradition involving spoken vows and the exchange of carved items, and a shared meal with the clan watching, which was considerably more elaborate and considerably more emotional than Shagrol had apparently anticipated, based on the brightness of her eyes at several points during it. Strongtusk gave them a carved horn, ancient and smooth with handling, which was, Shagrol explained quietly, a clan heirloom associated with first households. Morg gave it to Shagrol without ceremony, simply pressing it into her hands and saying something low and brief in Orcish, and Shagrol held it for a long moment before she looked up and found Warren's eyes, and the expression on her face was everything he had ever hoped for her. The child was born in late summer, a boy. He was broad-shouldered and had his mother's amber eyes and his father's nose and a small tusk nub that was barely visible and would grow slowly over his first years. He was loud and strong and had opinions about things from approximately his first hour of existence, which Warren felt was entirely on brand. They named him Warren Strongtusk. The double name caused some raised eyebrows in Duskfall and was entirely unremarkable in Strongtusk territory, which Warren thought was a reasonable summary of where they stood in both worlds. The years that followed were full in the way that good lives are full, not easy, never entirely easy, but full. The homestead grew. He expanded the north field in Korg's first year and added a proper barn in his second. And Shagrol's trade operation expanded into a standing partnership with 2 routes south, which meant she traveled several times a year and came home each time with the same quality of arrival she had always had, striding out of the tree line or down the wagon road with a pack over her shoulder, and everything she owned still fitting in that same practical arrangement she had walked into Duskfall with years ago. Duskfall itself changed slowly around them. Not dramatically, not all at once, because that is not how change works on the frontier. But Clement Harker's butcher stall changed hands eventually, and the man who took it over was a practical sort with no particular investment in the old opinions. The Reedmouth post keeper retired, and his successor was a younger woman who ran her trading post with the consistent practical policy of caring about quality and price and nothing else. Old Merritt stayed until she was ancient and died in her sleep, which was the right ending for her. There were still hard days. People who arrived in Duskfall with settled prejudices and announced them in the market road or at the tavern. Situations where Warren put himself in the way of something and Shagrol put herself in the way of something, and they came home to the cabin and sat by the fire and talked it through with the grounded practicality that was their shared mode. He never pretended the world was other than it was. She never stopped standing straight in it. Their second child was a girl, born when Korg was 3. She had green skin and Warren's brown hair and her grandmother Morg's granite disposition, and her father's habit of noticing things people were not saying. They named her Mara, a name that existed in both Orcish and the common tongue with slightly different meanings. In Orcish, it meant something like enduring, and in the common tongue it was simply a name, and they felt this duality was appropriate. Korg and Mara grew up bilingual, which Shagrol insisted on from before they could speak. Korg had his mother's physical ease and his father's patient consideration, and became, in his teenage years, genuinely remarkable at the specific social task of moving between two worlds without losing himself in either. Mara was more private, more interior, with a habit of sitting still in the way her mother sat still, watching and assessing before she committed to anything. Morg Strongtusk came south for Mora's first winter. Warren had not expected it, and suspected Shagrol had not fully expected it either, though she showed nothing when the rider arrived with word that the clan elder was 2 days north and requesting accommodation. He prepared accordingly. Morg arrived on a cold afternoon with 2 other clan members as traveling companions, surveyed the homestead with a thorough professional eye, accepted a cup of strong tea, and sat at the table across from her daughter and son-in-law with the air of a woman conducting a final inspection of something she had been keeping track of from a distance for years. She watched Warren with Korg, who was 2, and wanted to show his grandmother a specific rock he had found and kept and considered significant. She watched Shagrol at the fire, the ease of her, the way she moved through this space as though the cabin and the land around it were simply continuous with her own body. She watched Warren and Shagrol together, not the soft moments because those were not on display but the small working ones, the efficiency and the communication and the way they moved around each other. At the end of the second evening, while Shagrol was putting Korg to bed, Morg Strongtusk sat at the table across from Warren and said, with the same directness she had always deployed, "She is happy." He said nothing because it was not a question. "She carries your father's name in her son," Morg said. "She chose to do that. Her father was a good man," Warren said. "From everything she has told me, he deserves to be carried." Morg looked at him for a long moment with those amber eyes that were her daughter's eyes in an older face. Then she said, "You are not what I expected." "What did you expect?" he asked. "Something smaller," she said, and there was the almost smile unmistakable and brief, and he understood then where Shagrol had come by it. After Morg left, Shagrol came to find him where he was banking the night fire, and she stood beside him and was quiet for a moment. "She approves," she said, "in case you could not tell." "I could tell," he said. She leaned her shoulder against his and he put his arm around her, and they stood looking at the fire in the way they had always stood looking at fires, comfortable and particular in each other's presence and in no hurry to be anywhere else. "Warren," she said. "Yes," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "I am glad you walked across that road," she said. He looked at her. She was looking at the fire, the way she sometimes looked at things when she was saying true things that cost her, the way she did not always look at the thing directly when the thing was very dear. "So am I," he said. "I did not think," she said, "when I walked into that market with the elk, I did not think that anything good would come from it. I was braced for the same thing I had always gotten." "And instead you got me," he said. The almost smile came, fully, warmly. "And instead I got you," she agreed. He kissed her temple and she closed her eyes for one moment, and then opened them and straightened. Because Shagrol Strongtusk did not remain soft and still for very long. It was not in her nature. But the moment had happened, and it was real. And it went into the collection of real things between them that had been building since an October afternoon in a frontier town, when a man set down a grain sack and walked across a road because someone was standing there alone, and he was not a person who could watch that happen and keep loading sacks. The winters continued, and the summers continued, and the homestead grew, and the children grew, and the trade routes that Shagrol ran became, over years, a recognized and profitable operation with a small reputation for fair dealing that extended south through Reedmouth and north through the mountain passes. Warren's trap line shrank slightly as he put more land under cultivation, not abandoning the trapping but broadening, the way a life broadens when it is properly lived. He kept the smooth stone on the shelf above the window, the one she had left for him the first time, before they had become anything, before she had trusted him with anything more than the use of his stretching frames. The one with the geometric mark that meant given freely. He kept it there through all the years, and sometimes he looked at it and thought about the woman who had walked into a hostile market alone with a dead elk over her shoulders, and stood her ground with her jaw tight and her amber eyes calculating and her absolute refusal to be made small. And then he looked around at the life around him, and felt something that was not sentiment exactly, but was close to it, something more like the specific satisfaction of a man who chose well and knew it. On the 15th anniversary of that first day, he had counted. He was a methodical man. He came in from the barn in the early evening and found Shagrol at the east window, looking at the shelf where her carved items still stood, the same shelf they had always stood on, now more crowded with years of accumulation. The clan horn from Morgue, a drawing Korg had made when he was 4, a small stone Mora had decorated, other small tokens of a life well assembled. She turned when he came in, and she was herself, exactly as she had always been, present and direct and formidable and warm in the specific way she had always been warm, which was not the easy warmth of people who distribute it broadly but the particular and serious warmth of someone who gives it completely when she gives it at all. He crossed the room and stood beside her at the window, and they looked at the shelf together. 15 years, he said. I have been keeping count, she said. I know, he said. He did know. She always knew exactly how long things had been, a product, he thought, of a life of trade and timing. He put his hand in hers, the way he had done across a table in a storm-lashed winter years ago, and her fingers closed around his with the same certainty as always, strong and deliberate and complete. The clan that does not weep, he said, gently, not as a provocation but as something close to tenderness. What do they say about joy? She considered this. He watched her face, the high, beautiful angles of it, the ivory tusks, the amber eyes that had carried him in their gaze for 15 years. There is a word, she said. It means something between satisfaction and abundance. It does not translate exactly. She paused. My mother uses it rarely. She used it when she saw Korg walking the pass this last summer. What does it feel like? He asked. She turned her head and looked at him, and the almost smile was there. But by now he understood the almost smile was just her face's quiet way of holding what was too large to be expressed directly, and that behind it she was full, that she had been full for years, that the Strongtusk woman who came from a clan that did not weep had found in a small frontier cabin with a man who asked nothing of her, a fullness that required a word her language did not quite have in common translation. Like this, she said. And she put her head against his shoulder, fully, without the brief press and release of their early years, simply rested her head there, and he put his arm around her and held on. And outside the autumn was beginning, the trees turning amber and red in the hills, and inside the fire was going, and somewhere in the loft the children were arguing about something with the cheerful, focused energy of children who have never been afraid. He stood there with her and held the weight of it all, the years and the life and the love, and the small stone on the shelf above the window with its carved mark. And he did not say what he thought, which was that he had seen her cry, once, long ago, alone at the window with her father's memory in her hands, and had kept that quietly and completely as the most private gift of someone else's trust, had tucked it away where it lived only in him. In the place where the things that are too precious to ever name are kept. He had never told her. He never would. It was hers to keep, that moment, that quiet grief, that single thread of her interior life that she had shown without knowing she was showing, and he held it with the same steadiness with which he held everything she had given him, which was all of herself, given freely, marked with the particular symbol she had left him the first night before she had known she was leaving it. The evening came on around them, warm and full, and the fire burned, and the children's voices rose and fell upstairs, and Shagrol Strongtusk stayed where she was, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her, both of them looking out the window at the autumn hills in the last of the day's long light. And the frontier went on as it always did, rough and wide and indifferent to small human and orc dramas, except that this particular drama was not small at all. It was the whole thing.